We're so excited to host this series as part of the Singapore Unbound Literature Festival over the last couple of days. We have had a long time, I think, partnership with the Singapore Literature Festival. We hosted a few events 2 years ago, and maybe you saw one of our booksellers at a couple of the, or a few of the events over the last few days. So we have lots of books from many of the authors who spoke during the last few days, as well as we have a few other titles, hopefully celebrating all the great work that's been done this week. I don't have too much more to say other than we're so pleased to have everyone here, and let me go ahead and introduce Chye. Great.
Hi, thank you, Cody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to How Graphic Novels Work, the Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye, the final day of the second Singapore Literature Festival in New York City. We started the festival in 2014. This biennial festival brings together Singaporean and American authors for conversations about literature and society. We are an independent, volunteer-run festival funded by Singaporean and American well-wishers and partnering institutional partners in New York. We are proud and honored to partner with Asian American Writers Workshop, Asia Society, New York University, Stony Brook University, Adelphi University, Hunter College, and today with Book Culture Bookstore to bring you this festival. Besides festivals, we also run the second Saturday's Reading Series, a monthly literary salon held in various private homes around the city. We have featured Vijay Seshadri, Monique Trong, James Hannaham, and Amanda Lee Koh. In this upcoming season, Claudia Saraya, Naomi Novik, and Chinelo Okparanta will be reading. So if you would like to actually subscribe to this mailing list, please let me know. We're very excited to be bringing the festival and the reading series, together with our arts blog and a boutique press, into a new literary non-profit to be called Singapore Unbound. It is perhaps better described as a movement instead of a non-profit, for it is powered by the movement of people and ideas between our two countries, Singapore and the United States. You can read all about this new movement in the festival program. We're pleased to offer a new fellowship called Singapore Unbound Fellowship to one student. The successful applicant will help with program development, event organizing, and social media. So please get in touch if you're interested. Singapore Unbound is also the theme of this year's festival. Singapore is a very small country in many ways. Throughout its history, even before the arrival of the British, during the period of Malay political rule and Buddhist trade dominance, Singapore has looked beyond itself for the exchange of goods and ideas. In the last two nights of the festivals, the festival authors have explored Singaporean and American perspectives on race and sex and discussed the fictionalization of Southeast Asia. Last night, we presented 3 plays, 2 by Singaporean playwrights based in Singapore, and 1, the third, by a Singaporean based in New York. Today, we focus on the New York Times best-selling graphic novel, The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye, by the Singaporean graphic novelist, Sunny Liu. Hailed widely as a masterpiece, The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye weaves together the fictional biography of an artist, the eponymous Charlie Chan, with the history of Singapore and the history of comics. We are very pleased and honored to have 4 wonderful speakers with us today to speak about the artistic achievements of this milestone book. Douglas Wolk writes about comics and graphic novels for the New York Times Book Review, Time, Rolling Stone, The Washington Post, The Believer, and elsewhere. He is the author of Reading Comics, How Graphic Novels Work and What They Mean, from which we have stolen the title for this event, as you would have noticed. It won the Eisner and the Harvey Awards, and another book called Life at the Apollo. A National Arts Journalism Fellow and a Getty USC Annenberg Arts Journalism Fellow, Fellow. Wolk teaches comics writing at Portland State University and is currently working on All of the Marvels, a book about reading all 25,000 Marvel superhero comics, forthcoming from Penguin. Douglas is also moderating the discussion after the presentations. Ying Zipek is a Singaporean and a PhD candidate in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. Based in New York City, she's a Helena Rubinstein Fellow of the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program for 2016 to 2017. Matt Humphreys recently joined Dynamite Entertainment as an assistant editor after working at DC Comics in the same capacity. At DC, he helped edit Batman, Grayson, and Gotham Academy. Previously, he worked for Art Forum and Book Forum magazines. And last but not least, Colin Go. Colin Go is one half of the team behind Dim Sum Warriors, a graphic novel series about kung fu fighting dumplings that has been featured by Fast Company, Time, the New York Times, and Publishers Weekly. It is now being adapted for a stage musical which premieres in Shanghai in 2017. In Singapore, he's perhaps best known for founding the satirical website talkingcock.com and authoring the best-selling Coxford Singlish Dictionary. It will be a wonderful presentation from all four speakers. And there will be a discussion after the presentation, so I hope you will have many questions for our speakers. And afterwards, there will be light refreshments as well as books for purchase. So I'd like to welcome speakers to take their chairs. And please put our hands together for Douglas Wolk, our first speaker.
Thank you so much, G. So is this the clicker for this? Okay. So I think our other speakers are going to be talking a lot about the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye. I'm going to be talking a little about Sonny Liu's career up to that point and beyond that point, and some of the things that have gone into his artwork. As the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye is very much a book about artistic influence, and Sonny Liu has talked a bunch in interviews about the things that have, the artists who have particularly inspired him. One name that always comes up is Daniel Clowes, who's probably best known for Ghost World and 8 Ball is the series that he did for a long time. This is a page from 8 Ball. It's an adaptation of some interviews that David Greenberger did for the Duplex Planet, but the kind of talking heads, pale background, just individual quotations, and that's something that shows up a lot in Liu's book. I just didn't mean to do that. Wrong side. There we go. Another artist from that same generation, the early 90s, doing something very similar that was also a gigantic influence on him is Chris Ware. This is from the German edition of Jimmy Corrigan, The Smartest Kid on Earth. But the way that instead of going for the most visually compelling in its own right image, as pretty much every previous generation of American cartoonists had done, Ware is one of the generation that thought, like, if you frame things in a way that is minimal, that takes away as much information as possible, that can also be a really compelling thing. And this looks a lot like the end papers of The Art of Charlie Chan. This is another Chris Ware piece. This is from around 1990, a piece he published in Raw magazine called I Guess, or sometimes Thrilling Adventure Stories. And it's a memoiristic piece. It's a lot of the cartoonists of that early 90s generation that went straight into Sonny Liu's head were interested in telling their own stories, in telling the stories of their own lives, but framing them in ways that were kind of refracted in the same way that Liu's book is. And this is, in fact, a very personal confessional story about Chris Ware's childhood. As far as its text goes, all the images look like a Golden Age superhero story. Hit a lot of people pretty hard when it came out. This is not an American artist. This is the Malaysian artist Lot from, I believe this is from his book Kampung Boy. And that's another artist that Sunny Liu has mentioned a lot in interviews. This book was actually published, the first time it came out in English was just a couple years ago, for a second published an American edition of it. And one other name that always comes up in interviews with him is Chester Brown. This is a very early comic by Chester Brown from Yummy Fur, of the Happy Clown story. Chet Doodley here is his kind of refracted self-portrait. Chester Brown, like Chet the artist. You can see how similar he looks to the actual Chester Brown self-portrait from the comic a couple years later. And this doesn't look quite so much like Sunny Liu's work, although I'm sure if he wanted to do an impression of this, he could do as uncanny a visual impression as he does of everybody else he does in this book. One other very interesting source for the art of Charlie Chan is not so much Charles Schulz's Peanuts stuff, although that figures into it a little bit, but the book from which this is drawn, which is The Art of Peanuts, The Art of Charles M. Schulz, which was a 2001 book of Charles Schulz's work designed by Chip Kidd. And Chip Kidd was really the first person designing historical books about comics to kind of represent old artwork in its most physical form. Like, you can see the tape that's still on things, you can see the bad cut lines, and there's the very neat type off to the side. Chip Kidd is the design director of Pantheon, which published The Art of Charlie Chan. The book was actually designed by Sunny Liu himself, but you can see he got a lot from this. Like, let's just show the grain of the original document, even though he was making up the documents himself. This is one of the first things that Liu ever published on his own. This is a strip called Frankie and Pooh that he published in a newspaper in Singapore around 1996. Last panel's caption, you can say, "A clear-cut case of self-censorship and responsible cartooning if I ever saw one." You can already see the political edge creeping into his work, which is fantastic. He didn't really publish anything in America, though, until from, I believe, 1999 to 2001, or 2001 to 2003, I'm not sure which, but he went to RISD. He went to the Rhode Island School of Design, where there's a cartooning program and a cartooning workshop that's run by the fantastic American artist David Mazzucchelli. And in 2001, he went to ComicCon International in San Diego, the same trip that the artist in his book makes. The artist in his book really doesn't seem to get any attention at all out of the trip to San Diego. It worked out much better for Sunny Liu. He ended up having a conversation with Chris Claremont, who was the writer who wrote X-Men for many, many years and basically made X-Men what it was. And that led to his first American work, which was this pin-up of Iron Man that appeared in a comic that was published a little bit later. Kind of a futuristic redesign of Iron Man there. You can already see like the gorgeous, stylized look creeping into his work. One of his big class projects at RISD was a comic called Malarkey Robot. And he's done a number of Malarkey Robot short comics over the years, but this was a comic called Stinky Fish Blues, Malarkey Robot Stinky Fish Blues, which he published himself, 40 mimeographed copies that he sold at the local comic book store. And then he applied for a Xeric grant. The Xeric Foundation is the foundation that was started by Peter Laird, one of the creators of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, to do something with all of that Turtles money. And the Xeric grant doesn't exist anymore, but it was a grant to young cartoonists to self-publish their work. And so he won a grant to republish the first Malarkey Robot comic, and that's what really brought him some broader attention. You can see some of the Otomo Katsuhiro influence. You can see some Jeff Darrow. All the stuff that's like flowing into his head at a young age is coming out in this. There were Malarkey Robot short stories published in various places. There were a couple of one-shots. There's a collection of it that came out some years ago. His first really high-profile American work, though, was a mini-series for Vertigo called My Faith in Frankie. That name Frankie, for some reason, just keeps popping up in his work. This was written by Mike Carey, who is the same writer who wrote Lucifer. It's a miniseries about a young woman who's had her own personal god since she was born, watching over her. Except now she's a little bit older and she's getting interested in boys, and her god is a jealous god. And it gave him some room to do some of his stylistic experimentation. He's also talked about Calvin and Hobbes being a big influence on him, and this is a page of My Faith in Frankie that's seeing Frankie and her pals. That's the sort of approximation of that kind of style. After that, he did an Alice in Wonderland comic that was initially published by Slave Labor Graphics as a Disney thing, and then Disney republished it themselves. A graphic novel, again with Mike Carey, called The Regifters, that came out from DC Comics' Minx imprint. And through all this time, he was also publishing stories in the Flight anthologies that were edited by Kazuki Buishi. And the first Flight anthology actually came out, I believe, the same year that he went to ComicCon 2001. And in fact, it was published at that Comic-Con. Anthologies of comics by unknown artists don't tend to have a giant impact. Flight had a gigantic impact. If you look at the first Flight anthology, maybe 3/4 of the artists who are in it are still professional cartoonists. That's an amazing batting average. Kazuki Buishi, the editor, is, he most recently did the illustrations for the most recent editions of the Harry Potter books. And Sonny Liu he had stories in a few volumes of this anthology, and he started doing a similar anthology of his own, which he co-edited, Liquid City. There were 3 volumes of it that were published between 2008 and I think last year, it's in the tradition of Flight, but it's all Southeast Asian cartoonists. He's tied into that scene and trying to get his peers broader exposure too. A couple years after that was his one and only Spider-Man story. Before the Roachman, this was a story that was written by Roger Langridge, who's a British and New Zealand cartoonist who has a very similar kind of aesthetic to his in a lot of ways. This is an actual printed page of the story. You can see him sort of doing the thing where you show the materials of the work, you show the borders of the drawing board, you show the pasted up work, and at the end there's a little Little Nemo and Slumberland homage. That's was until fairly recently the only relatively straight-ahead American superhero comic he'd done, but there'll be more. But before then, he was doing the covers for Marvel's adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, which was packaged to look like a teenage girls magazine for reasons that escape me, and ended up drawing both the covers and the interiors of the subsequent Sense and Sensibility adaptation, which you'll see there. He returned to superheroes in a way by teaming up with Gene Luen Yang, the now MacArthur genius who did American-Born Chinese. They did this book together about the secret history behind the unknown or the little-known cartoonist, who was the first major Asian American cartoonist in the 40s. I can't tell if this is a hoax or not. If it is, they covered their tracks really well. If it isn't, it still doesn't make sense. It feels like it should be. I'm not sure, but this book exists and came out a couple of years ago. There's also a book that was never published in America. This was published by, I believe, the Singapore Art Museum, Warm Nights, Deathless Days, which is a biography of an early 20th century painter. And it was after that he really started devoting himself full-time to Charlie Chan Hock Chye. But this is very much a dry run for that. It's all done in vintage comic strip format, to the point where each strip has its own title and setting bar, which is a thing that you don't really see happening in newspaper comic strips anymore, and haven't since the 40s or so, when strips had this dimension. What he's been doing for the last year since finishing The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye is he's been drawing Dr. Fate. Straight up DC Comics superhero series written by Paul Levitz, the former publisher of DC. That's been going on for about a year. It's ending in a couple of months, but he's still, he's doing amazing formal stuff here. This is the cover of the first issue, and it's a New York City subway wall mural. Here's an interior page that shows a lot of J.H. Williams' influence creeping into his work still. He's still got very, very open eyes. He's drawing on everything he sees. This is a Hawk Girl story that I think is going to be coming out imminently. This is just a preview page that was just published. And even up to right now, he's still drawing in every available moment. This is not a thing he was hired to do. This is fan work. This is something he just stuck up on his blog a couple of weeks ago. 4 episodes of a comic strip inspired by watching Stranger Things on Netflix. Which brings us back around to the book that our other three extraordinary panelists are going to talk about. Ian Japek, please take over and tell us stuff.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, G, for the invitation. Probably just a small caveat before I start speaking. I am a Singaporean art historian, but I'm not an art historian of Singaporean or Southeast Asian art. So I'm really weighing in as someone who has spoken about sort of visual culture and also, I guess, speaking about images that sort of have really struck a chord in a way. And I will try my best to answer questions about Southeast Asian visual culture, but I'm by no means an expert in this. So just starting out here with those end papers on the book that Douglas had mentioned. Telling the history of Singapore to the history of comics, Liu nominates an uncustomary figure to the official account. That is, an account of great men, perhaps one great man, who create history through struggle and triumph. By the way of the summary, let me turn to the seminal essay by Southeast Asian historian T.N. Harper, who describes this formidable rival to Lee Kuan Yew more succinctly and eloquently than I could. Just Lee Kuan Yew, that sort of signifies to almost everyone. Great. I cite Harper. Lim Chin Siong is an elusive presence in Singapore's history. He was a charismatic catalyst to the mass movements of the 1950s and early 1960s, and his political personality helped define an era. Preeminent in the struggle for independence, his arrest and detention in February 1963 was a condition for its achievement. And yet today, Lim appears a strangely remote figure in the historical record of his times. In the decades after 1963, a clear narrative has emerged of a quote-unquote Singapore story. It is a story of a battle against the adversities of geography and of world history, through which the nation was fashioned by the heroic vision of its founding fathers. Yet this is a narrative in which Lim Chin Siong occupies a marginal and deeply problematic space." End quote. Just as the histories of comics and his country are intertwined under Sunny Liu's pen, three lives are brought together in the graphic novel: the political lives of Lee Kuan Yew and Lim Chin Siong, as well as that of the eponymous comic artist Charlie Chan Hock Chye. Because of his underdog status, and despite his Chinese name, which means good fortune and wealth, Chan identifies strongly with Lim Chin Siong. When Lim typically occupies a minor chapter in Singapore's history, in her official narratives, like in school textbooks, Lee and Lim are cast as equally opposed rivals, as superhero comic book arch rivals, each actor's political existence mutually exclusive to the others. And this is for me very poignantly typified in this opening sequence here with the end papers. I'm sorry about the scan. And it's headed by actually a Chinese proverb that Sunny Liu has also translated there: "One mountain cannot abide two tigers." It's pretty harsh, I would say. One of the graphic novel's main operations is to play out this rivalry as the leitmotif of numerous comic strips, taking on with it a bit of reductionism, I would argue, that is inadvertent to such bold delineation. Thus, although we are presented with a dossier of Charlie Chan's works made over the decades, rich in styles, techniques, and mediums, there is something monolithic to the construction of Charlie's and Lim Chin Siong's characters as anti-heroes, both as foils to Lee Kuan Yew. And by no means, and they are not little people, I would argue. Chan is a struggling Chinese, that is of the racial majority, straight artist who is more interested in self-expression than commercial success. It is no accident that the graphic novel, that is the history of the fictional Charlie Chan, is subtitled A Singapore Story. And the reader who works intertextually will be reminded that the first of Lee Kuan Yew's autobiographical tomes that weave together personal and national history is titled The Singapore Story. Sunny Liu's book has famously come under controversy in Singapore, that is. A finishing grant to the publisher was revoked by the National Arts Council, a state-supported subsidiary, because, and I quote, this is a statement that was published in the press, The retelling of Singapore's history in the graphic novel potentially undermines the authority or legitimacy of the government and its public institutions, end quote. In public statements following the book's publication, Liu avers that he hadn't intended to contribute to a controversy with this book. In my conversation with Liu this summer, he was quick to mention that he was merely bringing another narrative to the table, but wasn't trying to correct or adjust an official narrative. And I sort of made a note to myself, having typed up the sentence, perhaps this distinction between the two clauses I've just mentioned is really only intelligible in Singaporean parlance. So Liu preferred the idea of, I quote, visual information that his graphic novel constitutes, perhaps because of the more neutral nuance that information connotes about how knowledge is being presented rather than pressed on to his readers. But information for me also captures the sheer amount of historical material that Liu addresses in his meticulously annotated dossier of Chan's works. For me, it was revealing that Liu's major visual inspiration was an historical work, and it's very interesting for me that Douglas had mentioned Chip Kidd's Schultz work. I think Liu had mentioned to me a history of comics by Roger Sabin, comics and graphic novels. It's also kind of encyclopedic text on the history of comics that's interspersed with a lot of, to my mind at least, the text is interspersed with a lot of variously sized illustrations. I wish to also draw your attention, if you've read or haven't read the book, to the extensive captioning that accompanies so many of Chan's scripts, as well as the fastidious footnotes at the end of the book. If read carefully, you'll glean a thorough reading list of academic titles and articles that mostly fall within the purview of specialists and only very interested citizens. To return to Liu's term visual information, there's perhaps something pedagogical about this graphic novel, about its careful, even very slightly pedantic way in which it lays out Singapore's history in text as much in image. Now turning to the imaginative fictions of Charlie Chan, which I do not mean to play down with my previous comments on the historical baseline of this graphic novel or its pedagogical thrust. I think for me, historical and fictional elements are sort of wrapped up in one another in the work. Each character or comic strip is a set of many layered Russian dolls, to use a trite metaphor, but sometimes it's history that's the outermost casing and sometimes it's fiction. We can maybe make light of Liu's ability to imagine with historical parameters by posing the question, who is Charlie Chan? And could there have been a Charlie Chan? And I hope to answer these questions in the rest of my talk. A Singaporean boy whose prodigious talent for drawing, when combined with inspiration from comics from England, Japan, Hong Kong, and above all America, that he encounters from the decades of the 1950s, Charlie Chan contributes to a small blossoming of comics in local presses. And herein lies one of Liu's greatest historical reimaginings. For Singaporean comics that resembled Charlie Chan's works from the 1950s through 70s wouldn't have in fact existed. Singaporeans were indeed reading comics that were brought in from abroad, but to my understanding, they were often prized commodities because of their scarcity and cost. And these comics wouldn't have received as wide a readership as in their home markets, where you think of a kind of disposable, kind of widely circulated, sort of cheaply printed sort of comic book. For Liu, the naming of his protagonist is in fact an allusion to the eponymous figure of Chan from Asian American director Wayne Wang's film Chan's Missing, rather than The Detective. Chan's mysterious disappearance is the propelling force of the movie's action, but we never get to meet him. He's a projection of what the film's other characters wish him to be, and we never quite pin down his true identity. This quality of irresolution and open-endedness is what I believe Liu wished for Charlie Chan, the comic artist, whose portrait is constituted by the various comics he creates. The artist character, who is actually most historically plausible, I'm just going to have to skip over a few slides here, and it's this character here. Let me pull up another slide. This is the same character. The artist character who's most historically plausible in the graphic novel is in fact the minor character Boon Seong, the Hokkien-speaking artist who was trained at a local art academy. Hokkien is one of the main dialects, Chinese dialects in Singapore. Boon Seong knows the ropes for commercial illustration, work which Charlie Chan turns his back on because he prefers artistic autonomy over his projects. At the Academy, and Boon Seong goes to the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, Boon Seong has also picked up techniques like watercolor and oil painting that he teaches Charlie. Boon Seong contributes single-panel cartoons to the local Chinese press, although elsewhere Charlie reveals his preference for narrative comic strips. The British didn't develop an art academy in Malaya or Singapore in the way that they had in India, or the French did in Vietnam and the Dutch in Indonesia. Much of art training in colonial Singapore, at the risk of oversimplifying this history, but this is largely true, was in fact pioneered and supported by the Chinese community, by Chinese patrons and pedagogues. Art societies and eventually academies were often influenced by schools and styles and debates developed by Chinese artists who had spent some time in Europe, and this included graphic styles taken up by modernizing Chinese artists around the time of the May 4th movement. And one of these examples, as Chan knows full well, is in fact Georgia Chen, the graphic novel that Douglas brought up, a commission, I think a 2012 commission by the National Museum. So although there were graphic and in particular satirical traditions in Singapore, they do look drastically different from Charlie Chan's work in style, and also because the form of the serialized comic strip wasn't in place. And I'm just going to show you here, for instance, very early on, this is from 1907, sort of one-panel satirical comics that would have been appearing in the Chinese language press, often very anti-colonial. Here, these are modernizing Chinese who are critiquing the Qing Empire, and so that they're being satirized as different kinds of animals, and these such Chinese interests were also spoken about and discussed by overseas Chinese communities. And let me show you another one here. This is an artist whose name might resonate with some of us in the audience. This is in fact the academician and the renowned painter Liu Kang's work from around the time of the Japanese occupation. So he published actually 3 pamphlets titled Chop Suey. They were sort of double-faced. Sorry, this word eludes me right now, but they're basically regular kind of books with a single illustration and a caption in English, that in a series of 3. And these were, I don't think you can read them now, but they sort of very graphically depict the atrocities of the Japanese occupation in Singapore. And let's see, it's actually pretty grim sort of illustrations that, at least for me, resonate really with kind of a longer tradition, say, in European art with Goya and his depiction of the atrocities of war. The Chinese artists in Singapore, strongly anti-colonial and supportive of the nationalist Malayan cause, which is a trope that also comes up in Sunny Liu's book. And let me just, for instance, pull up a picture like this. This is not a comic, but it's certainly an example of sort of realist art that comes up in Singapore around the time of the country's nationalization. And here, Chinese students, so they're wearing very similar kind of school uniforms to those that you see in Sunny Liu's book, are taking Malay language lessons there from the man who's standing with his back to a blackboard. So these Chinese artists were strongly anti-colonial and supportive of the nationalist Malayan cause, and deeply caustic and biting in the use of the graphic medium. There was a literal depiction of atrocity, or only thinly veiled references to political figures. For me, this same sense of sharp irony is exemplified by the mocking campaign posters that Charlie Chan creates after those circulated by Lee Kuan Yew's PAP government in the 1980s, which exhorted the public to be courteous or speak Mandarin. And for me, this is a sort of one of the kind of harshest indictments of government policy and really wonderfully encapsulated in graphic form. This is Chan's poster right here, and I'm just showing you an example here from the National Archives, which Chan models his poster after, but basically Chan is merging both the Speak Chinese movement history of the moment of the 1980s with the Chinese student protests and from the late 1950s. So in the years leading up to Singapore's independence, sort of Chinese students, rights of Chinese students to have develop a Chinese language education were actually quite brutally crushed. But ironically, then in the 80s, Lee Kuan Yew's government develops a bilingual policy, and the Chinese population is then ironically encouraged to speak Chinese. So you have here in the foreground an image of a Chinese student protester. So this would signify a student from the late 50s being beaten by a colonial policeman, and he says, "I can speak Mandarin." And part of the punchline also is in the sort of Chinese slogan for the whole Speak Mandarin campaign. Maybe someone could actually translate it better than me, but sort of, it is fitting for you as a Chinese person to speak Chinese. That the idea that speaking Chinese is right and fitting to one who is Chinese. In any case, for me, I guess in my account today so far, I am omitting representative examples of comics from the time following Singapore's independence, from the 70s onwards, though to my knowledge, at least in academic accounts, it seems that they have sort of lacked the same caustic bite, is usually what tends to be written about. And here I defer to Colin, who can perhaps speak to us a little more about the creation of comics in Singapore in the 70s, 80s, and onwards. On a more personal note, as a Singaporean with a 90s childhood, reading Liu's graphic novel definitely gave me a sense of friction, an instinctive sense that perhaps some boundaries were being crossed. Actual policies and people were being portrayed and taken apart in ways I have never encountered growing up in Singapore. Nonetheless, I wish to reiterate that we mustn't see Liu's work as being historically unprecedented, for I think his graphic novel can be placed in radical traditions of political cartoons in Singapore. Thank you.
You guys will allow me a moment of digression. Listening to Ian speak just made me think of something. Can everyone hear me? Oh, great. Look at that. It's already up there. I'm going to read from that. But your description of Lee Kuan Yew and Lim Chin Siong as sort of monolithic and Charlie as sort of an absence made me think that's sort of one of the key aspects of sort of sentimentalist storytelling. And there's a section on 52 and 53 in which he's doing his Tezuka impersonation, basically, and the pet dog gets thrown against the ground. And it made me think, is it manipulative? Sure, but that's how you tell stories. So my sense is that maybe the sort of casting of Lee Kuan Yew as villain and Lim Chin Siong as forgotten hero is a deliberate sort of sentimentalist technique, and that the absent figure of Charlie himself is to allow him actually to be sort of everyman artist, which leads to sort of the crux of what my reading is, which is it's not just a history of Singapore or a history of comics, it's also a love story. And I know that may seem kind of odd, but it's a very specific kind of love story, and I'll come back to that. So right off the bat, obviously, I'm going to be talking about the American comics and the sort of manifold references to other texts intertextuality, and illusions. And right off the bat, he's on page 6 and page 7, standing in a Kinokuniya bookstore and picking up his latest comics that week. And I thought that was interesting because right off the bat, you have sort of this post-colonial legacy of a Japanese bookstore in Singapore. But the comics he reads are mostly English comics because he's been English educated. And so it sort of makes sense that American comics and European comics with Eagle are part of his sort of cultural legacy, I guess, as a reader of comics. So right after to EC Comics. He meets Bertrand Wong and his beautiful sister Lily, who we're told looks just like the actress Yu Ming. And Bertrand is a huge fan of EC Comics. And EC Comics originally stood for Educational Comics, and they did illustrated classics. But it became Entertaining Comics when William Gaines, the original publisher's son, took over the company, and he started to do more popular Pulp Fiction style comics. And they did crime, horror, war, suspense, and science fiction thrillers. And they were actually one of the comic book publishers who were called to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency in the aftermath of Frederick Wortham's seduction of the innocent. So EC and Batman and Robin were really doing bad things to our kids. Wallace Wood gets mentioned in passing, but this here is a clear tribute to Harvey Kurtzman, who was the writer, artist, and editor of a number of the EC war comics, especially Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales. And he actually would later on to go and found Mad Magazine in an attempt to sort of make more money, which unfortunately didn't end up working out for him. And so this originally is from a comic called, or Chan's comic is Force 136, which starts off as a funny Aminals kind of version of war comics, but it gradually moves into the more EC serious war style. But that sets the stage for the transition into the next comic I'll be talking about, which is, I'm going to butcher this, so forgive me, but Bukit Chapalang, which is a Pogo tribute. So here you can see the comparison between Trust and The Big If, which is the Kurtzman story. And formally, you can see how they're using that first big panel as a means to sort of draw the reader in and let the eye sort of pause there for a moment. Scott McCloud has this theory on splash panels and two-page spreads that they sort of unmoor the eye from time. And so here, while we're not completely unmoored because we have subsequent panels below it in that sort of even thirds division, but we're invited to let time dilate and spend time examining those panels. And I think that still image of the man up against the chain link fence or barbed wire fence is sort of one worth meditating on. It's pretty powerful. Similarly, as is the image of the GI there before some sort of carvings, meditating on what you find out in the end is his own impending death, and that the big if is, if only I'd done something a little differently. If only I'd spent another second waiting before I crossed that road. Anyway, so thematically, Kurtzman's stories are actually a perfect fit for the kind of narrative that they're trying to do. Kurtzman was a humanist and presented very even depictions of the men in war in that both sides were portrayed as human beings. It's very even-handed stuff. He actually got into a big tiff with the artist Alex Toth, or Toth, I'm not sure how you say his last name, but about a panel in one of the stories he'd written, because Toth had gotten it so that the American fighter pilot had shot down 2 Russian MiGs. And Kurtzman felt by giving the U.S. Airmen that sort of victory and having him land and return and be celebrated, it made it a little too patriotic, a little too heroic, a little too, I guess, rah, rah, rah for him. And he felt like the Russian MiG was of equal interest and of equal valor. And I think, oh, that's the wrong one. Let me pull this up. This is a good example of it. And this story, Rubble by Kurtzman, which you can see on the right-hand side. And I picked these again to show this sort of formal echoes between the two comics. Liu clearly is working with the same sort of essential 9-panel grid that the EC comics work with, except he's varied the first 2 panels so that they occupy half the page, half of the third of the page, rather than even thirds. And Rubble's a really interesting story because it starts with a shot of a U.S. artillery emplacement on a pile of rubble. And then the rest of the story is spent following this Korean family as the father builds a house up from the very foundation up to the roof. And then only to see his family entirely killed and the house destroyed and the former foundation used as the very same artillery emplacement we see at the beginning of the story. So in fact, there's nothing heroic about the acts of war in the E.C. Kurtzman stories. People suffer through them. They're not heroic, I guess. Oh shoot, I keep hitting my computer instead of the panel. Sorry, guys. So right here, this is a page from Corpse on the Imjin, which is a story in which a USGI is sitting by the Imjin River. He sees a corpse float by it. That's the opening big still image. And an enemy combatant comes up next to him and tries to fight him, and they end up in unarmed combat, and he ends up drowning him. And I chose this panel because you can see how sort of expressionistic and abstract his work threatens to be, just that descent into the darkness of the river where ink just dominates each panel. And there's very little light. And you can see in the body language of the GI as he, in that last line of panels, his shoulders are rounded, slumped. This is not a triumphant victory. There's no glory in his surviving this encounter. And I think that's a big part of why we chose these stories as an influence, as a way to talk about war while avoiding sort of the pitfalls of glory, and get a chance to use a humanist perspective. So anyway, here's some of the covers. You can see, originally they weren't allowed to say hell on the cover of the EC comics, on the one on the right. So it said, heck, we didn't retreat, we just advanced in another direction, but I think they altered it for the collection. So on a slightly lighter note, we go to Pogo, which is what Force 136 sort of started more closely to stylistically, before it went a little bit more Art Spiegelman and sort of funny aminals and not very funny situations. But here on top you have the Walt Kelly Pogo, which takes place in the Okefenokee Swamp and follows a large cast of characters. Kelly was trained as a Disney animator, and you can really see that in his style. And elaborate wordplay was another one of his sort of hallmarks as a artist and writer. There's a lot of alliteration, malapropism, and sort of wordplay of all sorts. And there's an interesting note in one of the prefaces to this collection, which is that his father said over dinner one night, "Language is the worst means of communication known to man." And he said, if I'd drawn a picture of an apple, his wife would have understood just as well that he wanted an apple for dessert. And I think there's something actually sort of profound about that thought in the context of cartooning, in that we don't need, Charlie, in those first pages, he admits quite freely he couldn't read Tezuka's work because he didn't speak Japanese, he spoke English. And yet, nonetheless, Tezuka was a powerful, powerful inspiration and influence to him. And that, I think, is one of the lovely things about comics, is it does manage to sort of transcend language by means of a straight-ahead representation. So anyway, here is actually distorting a bit actual representation of political events into satire, which is fun. And let me just move on to the next panel. That was another thing that Pogo was particularly skilled with. This is one of the probably more famous storylines about a cat named Simple J. Malarkey, who, not so coincidentally, looks exactly like Joe McCarthy. And this storyline started running in the early 50s, right as the Senate Army, the McCarthy Army trials were going on, where McCarthy had, claimed that there were communist spies in the Army, in the Senate, all throughout the government. And so Pogo sort of lampooned this guy by having they had the deacon of the swamp, who's a pious busybody, brought in his friend the mole, Macaroni, who carries a pump gun full of disinfectant and is constantly worried about, "We must make the air safe for our native nostrils again." And together they form a birdwatchers club, and then they decide to keep the migratory birds out and start trying to get the wise owl kicked out of the swamp. And when things start to get a little heated, they bring in Simple J. Malarkey, who's basically a thug and a heavy, to try and be their enforcer. And he ends up, as you can see in this comic here, taking over the entire club. And the end of the strip series, the strip story arc, ends with Malarkey and the mole basically in a fight to the death as a buzzard sort of walks off panel chasing the two of them. So it got a little dark, actually. And anyway, this is sort of just before the end of the Malarkey storyline on top. And I chose this panel just because I liked the name on the boat. It's the HMS Herbert Block. And Herbert Block, or Herb Block, was a political cartoonist and satirist whose drawings were very famous, and he was actually a big part of making McCarthy a laughingstock. Him and the televised Army McCarthy hearings were a big part of what destroyed McCarthy's credibility. And so below I have it next to Chan or Liu's Hinterland Saga, which I think similarly takes sort of serious political issues and turns them into a sort of delightful farce, with the hinterland being a discussion of the possible merger with Malaya. Is Roachman and Spidey. And here I chose these because I just think it's so funny how he accurately took Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's sort of ham-handed, corny direct address to the readers, and as like marketing kind of, or proto-marketing stuff, so you get to see all the details of Spidey's costume. Also worth noting, which Liu also notes, that Roachman's costume is very similar to the classic pulp hero, the Shadow, although it also, in the way that Liu is excellent at doing, it also pays homage to clothes of workers at the time, as well as the scarves that middle school students would wear in protest. And I think he chose SpiderMan as a reference point because it's, at its core, a sort of class struggle. You know, a loathed outsider, in this case Peter Parker as a school nerd, or Agwan, the Night Soil Man, is forced by extraordinary circumstances to use his powers for the good of society, despite his disenfranchisement. And I think that's pretty inspiring, and perhaps not surprisingly, given that he's sort of the hero of the piece, it's connected with the figure of Lynch Seong. And here you can see how, again, how powerful gesture is in cartoons. You don't have to be able to read these panels to know instantly from the color, from the physical work of the line, that these are panels about despondency. And I think it's worth reading the text above Liu's panel. This is in the aftermath of the anti-left Operation Cold Store in 1963, where the Singaporean Malayan and British governments imprisoned the left-wing leaders, including Lim Chin Seong. And it reads, "During this second period of incarceration, Lim reportedly struggled with depression. After an attempted suicide, he was released on July 28, 1969, after agreeing to renounce politics and go into exile in London." So there's a bit of a jump between this and the previous panel. And this is a comic, sort of a counterfactual account of his trip to San Diego Comic-Con, which, you know, frankly is enough to induce despair in anyone. But this is a homage to Winsor McCay's, or at least the gag in the final panel is an homage to Winsor McCay's comic strip Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, in which the character would eat a rarebit cheese on toast before bed and would have these wild, sort of fantastical adventures in his dreams, and it would inevitably end with him falling out of bed and going, "Oh, that's the last time I eat rarebit," until the next strip. But the style itself owes more of an homage to Hergé and Sergio Aragonés, which unfortunately I'm not sure if you can see, but actually the comic editor he's talking to is flanked by Tintin and Captain Haddock there. And the Thompson twins, or to be precise, Thompson and Thompson, are there beseeching him as representatives of DC and Marvel. But I'm going to come back to my original assertion that this is a love story now, because the woman in the second to last panel is Lily Wong, Bertrand's sister. And what you see there in that final panel is she's saying, "For dinner tonight, I thought we might have some delicious rarebit," which of course suggests that none of this happened. He did not get to replace Todd McFarlane as the king of comics on Spider-Man. In fact, Liu summarizes his experience thusly: "Chan's San Diego Comic-Con experience turned out to be a mixture of excitement and disappointments. He would write that it had given me a glimpse of what comics and a comics community could aspire to be, but I remained an outsider looking in, unable to become a member of the club, however much I longed to do so." And so I think, for me, part of the love is about the cost of comics, because here we have an image of Lily getting married to a mutual businessman she met through mutual friends, and we get a callback to that earlier image, his first depiction of her. And as I was looking at this, a lot of my comics friends, as they draw, they tell me it's a very intimate experience. And I think drawing a portrait of someone you care about like that has to involve, to a certain degree, an act of love. Love for a friend, Bertrand, love for Lily here. I don't think it's an anonymizing strip we see across that businessman's face. Although it can be read as such, I think it's actually an act of quiet, unrequited passion. And that's what I think the story is. It's a story about unrequited love. In a very specific way. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, since he's in this moment of sort of darkness in the aftermath of his father's death and dealing with the San Diego Comic-Con and the disappointments there, he turns to Frank Miller and The Dark Knight Returns, which is sort of a very bleak and sort of proto-fascist vision of Batman set in a near-distant future. And this is a clear homage to Miller's setup. This is how Miller begins The Dark Knight Returns. So you see the same, let's see, can I go back? Oh, there we go. So you see the same use of talking heads on a curved panel to indicate a TV screen. And there we go. What's interesting, too, is that Dark Knight Returns is out of standard continuity, and Days of August, this Miller pastiche, is a contrafactual narrative as well. And this, Lim Chin-seong and has won the 1963 election, and Singapore remained an independent state. And it's sort of a utopian depiction, which is a funny inverse of the Miller comic, in which Gotham has gone to hell and is overrun with a bunch of gangs called the Mutants, who are just making things terrible for any sort of upright citizen in Gotham. Whereas, quite frankly, oops, keep doing that, the city here looks utopian. Singapore looks sort of lovely. And the descriptions in the sort of talking heads is one of moderation and prosperity and a city thriving. And so, of course, enter into this, the villain of the piece, actual history. Here, you've got the iconic image of the lightning bolt and Batman returning as vigilante to bring his rough tumble justice to the city streets again. And here we have sort of an absence represented by what's called the Man in White, who causes chaos and destruction in this city, much as Batman does, in the force of recorrecting the historical narrative. There's a sort of Philip K. Dickey Man in the High Castle twist here, in that Chan inserts himself into the narrative. I don't think, unfortunately, I don't have this panel up there. They learn he's been having trouble with dreams based around this comic he was doing about a history, an alternate timeline to theirs, in which Kuan Yew won the election in 1963, and basically our timeline. And so he, it turns out, is reasserting himself. Time is trying to write itself into history. And then something really interesting happens. We see that Lee Kuan Yew's features in The Man in White, he's finally revealed, and there's a stylistic shift. And he moves into the autobiographical style that we've seen earlier on. And these comics have all been produced 88 onward, this style. And he abandons the Miller pastiche, and he moves into this. And Chan and Lim Chin-seong are thrown back into the past, into their younger versions of themselves in this timeline, to pre-independent Singapore in 1955. And Chan, as he talks with Lim Chin-seong, realizes he knows exactly what's going to happen to him. He knows our history, the arrests, the years of imprisonment, his attempted suicide in exile, and depression. But he doesn't tell him about it. And Lim Chin-seong says, you know what, I'm going to go off and do the things I did, because these things are worth fighting for. And I think that that's the moment of union between the two characters, is that Lim Chin Song does end up being this sort of lost man. He describes it as a lost man of Singapore. And I think Hock Chye is meant to be that kind of lost man too. He sits there and he's in the street and he realizes he knows his own fate as well. As for myself, there wasn't very much to look forward to. Just a lifetime of writing and drawing stories that no one would ever read. Neither wealth nor acclaim. Never to have a wife nor children of my own. I'd be a fool to go down that road again, except... And at that point, he stops at a periodical seller and he picks up a Walt Disney comic. I like to think it's a Carl Banks one, or Carl Barks. And he experiences a feeling he'd forgotten. Just a feeling of wanting to draw, of wanting to tell stories. Soon enough, he says, all those cares would surface on their own. But for now, let me dream of all the comics I have yet to draw, the life I have yet to live. And this is the final line. And of my country that is yet to be. And it's at this point I think he abandons himself to that unrequited love totally, to loving an intangible thing. In his case, it's comics. For Lim Chin Siong, it's his vision and dream for the country's future. And I think there's something very poignant and beautiful about his acceptance of what that love is going to cost him in this moment. To see clear-headed and clear-eyed what the future holds and choose that love. And I think that in this moment, this is the moment that justifies him as Singapore's greatest comic artist. That moment of choice, and the choice to move into his own stylistic art, no longer being a pastiche, no longer imitating others, but rather choosing his own art and hoping that one day he might reach even new heights. And so I think it's kind of a knowing but hopeful ending. And I think it's really quite lovely. So anyway, that's it for me. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm the last guy on the list, and you'll be glad to know, probably the shortest. I only found out yesterday, thanks G, that I was meant to give a 15-minute presentation with slides. And I tried composing it on my iPhone just now, and technical issues, so I'm afraid, I think actually it worked out for the best, because compared to the erudition and eloquence, analysis, and scholarly research today, I could not possibly hope to compete. But what I can offer is trivia. So yes, I have known Sunny Liu for, gosh, the longest time. I came to know of Sunny when I was doing a comic strip for Singapore's first tabloid. This was in 1987. I was 17 years old, and I was actually Singapore's very first daily strip cartoonist. It was also my first brush with censorship, but that's a story for another time. But I mentioned that because after I left for university, I decided to strip. And I think that was, 5-6 years afterwards. And Sunny carried on for, I think, 2 years. And then the editor calls me up and says, can you come back? Because he's off. And apparently, he was... I'm glad Douglas found that old strip, because yes, there was a certain amount of bristling under censorship in Singapore as well. So that's how I got to know him. I didn't meet him until years later, I think, when he finished his undergraduate studies and somehow came to work for my wife in an educational software firm doing cartoons. And that's when the first time I got to know him, and we got chatting, and Charlie Chan Hock Chye first turned up one night, I think around 2006, 2007. He calls me up and says, hey, can you come out and let's talk? I got this project. So I go out and, and he says, look, I got this idea that we could do this sort of weird alternate history of Singapore. I'm trying to get as many cartoonists together, and each of us will take a chapter, and we'll put it together. And I was like, do you have a publisher for this? And he was like, no. And, by this time, I was married with a job and stuff. It was pretty hard to go. So, I know he approached several others, and we were talking about it. We'd talk about it, and none of us were, in any urgency to embark on this unpaid work of, conceptually interesting though it was. And I think Sunny decided, you know what? I can outdraw all of you anyway, and so I'm just going to do it myself. So that's my take on probably what happened. The train left the station, and I think to everyone's to his huge benefit, I think. My other connection with Charlie Chan Hock Chye is, and to answer the question of who Charlie Chan Hock Chye is, Sunny, a couple of years back, three years back, he says, hey, and he emails me in New York. He says, can I get your dad's old photographs? Can I go to your dad's place and get his old photographs when he was younger and stuff? I was like, okay. And so he does. So I said, I had to badger my dad into it. He was like, what? I have no idea. So anyway, my dad's name is Goh Soon Chye. He had a son called Goh Soon Hock, hence Charlie Chan Hock Chye. And if you look in the book, you will see the character of Bertrand Wong. It is my dad. So, there you go. This will go in the footnotes. Hi, Sunny. I see what you did there. So yes, it is, of course, to answer the question in the preamble to this panel, is Charlie Chan Hock Chye the great Singapore novel? I think it certainly is the great Singapore graphic novel. And I say this partially because I see two of the greatest literary voices in Singapore here. Our great playwright, Alfian Saad, and Jeremy Tiang sitting somewhere in the back trying to hide away. So, yes, I will not presume to pronounce any of the great Singapore novel. I think that, but it is a fantastic piece of work. It is a huge work of ambition in trying to do so many styles and trying to retell the history. And I have to say, I suspect, this is my personal view, of course, as a complete layperson, I think how he was able to do this. A bunch of us Singaporean cartoonists got together recently and said, how come we didn't do this right? And somebody said, quite rightly, because he's Malaysian lah. Because Sunny is only a relatively new Singaporean. I think only a few years ago, right? He became a Singaporean. And I guess the gist of my fellow cartoonist thought was that none of us would even dare to touch this subject. It would have been baked into our blood that you just don't go here, not because we are necessarily scared or uninspired, but to face the avalanche of crap that will no doubt hit our way, would just not fit into our, I guess, pragmatic orientation. And Sunny no doubt attracted that avalanche of crap when his work, there's the whole controversy it stirred with the revoking of the National Arts Council grant. Although in hindsight, most of us agree that the National Arts Council did him the biggest favor of all. They withdrew a $30,000 grant and gave him like $80,000 in free publicity. It's fantastic. So yeah, biggest favor ever. Thanks. And I do think if there is one thing I feel about the piece of work as a fellow cartoonist is the one thing that makes my eye twitch maybe a little, or it's a feeling of absence, is you have a Singaporean cartoonist and the work he is inspired by is Tezuka, Japanese manga, British and American comics. And at that time, in the rest of Southeast Asia, there was actually a lot of comics going around. Malaysia had a great, there are several real great out there. Indonesia had some fantastic cartoonists doing really brave work as well. Pramono. Of course, we've seen Lat, and there are many more other great Malaysian cartoonists. Even now, Zuna is a fantastic voice. In the Philippines, Mas Santana was doing work that was as good and looked like Bollywood, this stuff. And I think many of the Filipino cartoonists later on went to work for Warren Publishing. They took on some of the work for DC and Marvel, and this is more or less forgotten. There were the Thai cartoonists, and I feel that if there was one element missing, I feel missing is connecting the Singapore story here to the rest of Southeast Asia, and to believe that there were just these American comics and Japanese comics, I think it's an oversight, and I do feel that. But he's not alone in that, and I don't think, in some ways, he's very representative of many of the cartoonists in Singapore. Many of the cartoonists in Singapore who tend to be predominantly Chinese look very much to Japan and Hong Kong for their inspiration, and not enough to the wider Southeast Asia, even though there's a lot of work there. And I think there is a book to be written there. I also feel it's kind of interesting to critique Singapore using the lens of American pop culture. It's not fully articulated in my mind, but to me there is a post-colonial thread there that maybe needs unpicking a little. If because of the vacuum you have with not mentioning Southeast Asia, the rest of Southeast Asia, in which a lot of things were going on, and the looking to America and sort of importing the aesthetic and the values that underlie it. I think there is something to be considered in that area. Oh, and with that, I'm going to call it end, and I guess we'll go to Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're going to open it up to the audience in a minute, but I have one question for you folks, and then if you have questions for the rest of us, between each other. There's one very kind of unusual, surprising thing about the narrative of this book that Liu kind of slips in under the radar, which is that this is a book in the form of a fest trip. It's a book that's celebrating the career of somebody and so you see the early years of bitter struggle, and you see the gradual development of craft, and then what you always see in this sort of book is the breakthrough moment, the moment where the utopia happens, where the artistic utopia happens, and then maybe you have a couple chapters at the end of the victory lap. That never happens in this book. Like, it's set up for his trip to San Diego to be his big breakthrough moment, and you see him sort of humiliated and neglected, and then it just kind of moves on from there. And that, I don't know if this is a thing that has political parallels. I don't know if this is a thing that reflects some sort of unrealized vision for Singapore. At the same time, the book is kind of the autobiography of the comics medium, and the comics medium has always has this kind of abject view of itself as a thing that's not living up to what it could be, and it could be that too. But I'm curious what your perspectives on that.
Someone want to take it first.
I guess I thought of it after your comment about sort of the political figures being sort of monolithic, that was a way of turning Charlie basically into the dog hit by the water cannon. And because it's easy to empathize with his failure and feel the sort of crushing blow of that, you sort of the close association between him and Lynch and Xiong, an actual historical figure, you sort of, I thought it was a way of connecting them very deeply and making you sort of feel, using formal, sentimental narrative architecture as a way of like making you feel for him. That was one thought I had, but yeah, I was struck by that as well.
Well, I have to agree. And I would say also that I think it's drawn very much from the real life experiences of cartoonists in Singapore. That if you've met them, they're pretty glum bunch. With good reason, I think. Singapore is, for those of you who don't know, it's a tiny country, not much of a market. I think in living memory, maybe only Sunny and one other Singaporean artist has ever managed to break out into mainstream comics. I'm talking about Sunny, and I'm talking about Stanley Arjun Lau, who does a lot of covers for DC and Marvel. I think of those, only these are probably the only two anybody ever knows about. So there is definitely a sense of their work not being appreciated. Many of the cartoonists also, it was already tough 20 years ago, and now it's even tougher with fewer bookstores, with crisis in publishing, who's going to get paid to do this, and there's a little bit of self-flagellation I see in Charlie Chan deciding to become a security guard so that he can sit there and draw his own stuff. I don't think it's an accident, it's a security guard, because he's guarding his own security in some ways. And but yes, there's definitely that kind of feeling that you are relegated to a life of poverty if you are following your dreams. It's not alone, and it's interesting coming from Sunny, who's probably the most successful Singapore cartoonist ever.
Yeah, now that I've thought about it a little more, I definitely think, I'm trying to figure out if I would say that it's a nostalgic work. That's something I've never used to describe the book. There's certainly a certain sense of loss that you beautifully described how he sort of knows he's not going to make it. But I think at the same time, in that I would see a certain sort of redemptive quality, that the very fact that you would dredge up a narrative and retell it, is it a sort of moment of utopia rather than one of sort of abject pessimism. It certainly is there. And I think Sunny, and this is just sort of, speaking as a Singaporean who is on the internet often and sort of follows up on news in Singapore via the internet more than anything else. I think certainly there's a sense of a sort of what's actually termed by the government as a revisionist telling of history. It's strangely not something coming from the academics themselves. It's something that is actually a pejorative, I think, viewed as a pejorative. It's a revisionist telling of history that I guess government officials, for instance, have used against a larger generation of both academics, and I think Sunny would fall into this category as well. So at the same time, I think there's a sense of a movement that's certainly what I think take this work out of its a necessary kind of fate as something that's sort of abject melancholy. And speaking of endings, something that Sunny and I spoke about, and I hadn't realized the timing of it. I'm just going to put it out there as a sort of event that happened close to the book's publication, was actually the death of Lee Kuan Yew. And the portrait that he made of Lee Kuan Yew, one of the numerous, actually, he has a really interesting working process. I hadn't realized that all these portraits were actually oil portraits made on canvas. They were sort of really large, kind of human-sized portraits that do exist in the studio and sort of have a life of their own as objects. I think that was either made sort of right before or right after the death of Lee Kuan Yew. So I'm not sure what kind of reading you want to make of that, but that sort of was there.
Thank you, Imoris. kind of inter-panel question before we take you from the audience?
So, anyone who would like to ask something, I only request that you must ask your question in the form of a question. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Well, for me, I'm an amateur filmmaker, so I'm going to speak from that particular perspective. I think it's great that Sunny's comic book has allowed us to sort of re-envision Singapore's issue, or at least try to critically think about what could have happened, and not just like taking wholesale like what we have learned in the Singaporean education system. But at the same time, I think that it would be a pity if we would just sort of like end it like right here, just like as a comic book, without going into like further conversations with like people who have lived through that period, or maybe people who have like suffered through that period as well. Recently, like I see like in Taiwan, for example, they have sort of like a very strong push towards having dramas, TV series about the post-war period, and that kind of like sort of like triggered a lot of like conversations amongst Taiwanese, and I think there were a lot of events as well that invited people who have suffered during the regime, right?
So is there a question?
So yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to go straight to the question. So I was just wondering, how can we like move towards more of a conversation instead of just sort of understanding that there might be other kind of like history that we might have like that Singapore might have taken. Like how can we move towards that? For me personally, I think film might be sort of like a gateway towards that. I mean, From Singapore with Love is like one example in which like film has tried to engage with that, but I think it's still kind of limited, in terms of scope. So how can we move towards that kind of direction? Yeah, towards more of a conversation.
Short answer: make your own stuff. I guess it's how you continue the conversation. The more of us who make stuff and question official narratives, we'll get there in whatever form. There's plenty of ways to do it. Good luck getting funding from the government if you're going to do with a different take on Singapore history, but there are ways, and I encourage you to go out there and just make it.
More questions?
Hi, thank you to everyone for your really wonderful presentation. So my question is, how do you think the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye has changed or will change the landscape of comics, both maybe from a Singaporean and an American perspective? I don't know if there is that much of an impact, even though I know it's a New York Times bestseller, but yeah, thank you.
It's hard to say how it's going to change the landscape, because there are not a lot of single works that change the landscape, but it raises the bar. It's the way that comics take a long time to make. Like, I'm sure 10 years from now, there's going to be a lot of people saying, yeah, I saw the art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye back in 2016, it was amazing, and now that we're in the future world of 2026. I don't know how. I think how exactly it's going to have its effect, but I think the kind of stylistic range that he's showing off, the kind of formal mastery of so many different kinds of cartooning, I'm really curious to see what comes out of that.
Okay. Sorry to be seen hugging this, but to the Singaporean cartoonists around, the phrase that was bandied about among Singaporean cartoonists was spoil market. For the Singaporeans who don't know this, in vernacular Singapore English or Singlish, it means, oh great, somebody has gone out there and ruined it for the rest of us, because from now on, everyone else's work will be secondary, derivative, what have you. And to some extent, that's true. He's shown more ambition and guts than the rest of us, and clearly the art style is fantastic. It is revolutionary for Singapore because nobody ever thought of either one, pulling this off and getting an outside audience. Most Singaporeans tend to think their work is only going to, it is a very parochial view. You know, it stays in the country. Nobody's going to get it. Lee Kuan Yew, you know, it stays here. Nobody cares. You're a tiny country, and will it get an outside audience? No. You know, the only way you're going to get to a wider audience is if you draw guys in tights beating the crap out of each other. And so he has definitely raised the bar. I look forward to a future where, you know, people will push, I guess Singaporeans will push the envelope and come close to the work of this ambition. I don't think it's going to come anytime soon. But, you know, it really was a meteor strike, I think, in Singapore. Definitely. It was a big, huge asteroid dropping in the Singapore comic scene, and more power to Sunny. He's also doing a lot of work behind the scenes to try and, I guess, raise awareness of Singaporean work. But it's still a way to go. I think to the rest of Singapore, it's a please, Marvel or DC, you know, throw me a bone.
As for me, I would love to see, at least on an American perspective, more comics creator trying more experimental works within the mainstream. You know, something using metafictional techniques or the sophisticated story structures, and certainly the art. I'd love to see more of him just drawing everything. At least from my perspective, I'd hope to see that in 2026.
We have time for one more awesome question.
I want to pick up on your comment about raising the bar and ask, what do you think? How do you place graphic novels in the larger literary scene in Singapore, and does this raise the bar for graphic novels in the wider literary scene? Or you earlier traced how this fits into a history of critical comics in Singapore from the Chinese community. So can you talk about that?
Well, I guess at the most personal level, I can tell you that I've not read I don't think I've ever read a Singaporean graphic novel prior to this one. So I think in terms of maybe getting readers from beyond a comics field, which I'm not at all well versed in, I think this sort of book really drew me in. So maybe that's one thing that can be said, that I think it's being sold and read in Singapore at a rate that definitely reaches beyond the comic audience. From what I understand, there were already, in the past maybe decade, there are already quite sophisticated graphic novels coming out of Singapore. Am I thinking correctly? Someone help me out there. So it's certainly not unprecedented, except in its sort of epic quality. But I would say, this is maybe the one book that drew so much national attention that I think you really couldn't look away if you were Singaporean and interested in Singaporean politics.
So, reading list, if you're interested in other Singaporean graphic novels, The Resident Tourist by Troy Chin, Gone Case by Dave Chua and Koh Hong Ting. They tend to be more, I guess, autobiographical in nature, a little more sort of kitchen sink drama, naturalistic comics. But definitely, Sunny is in a league of his own. I think even here in the States, a work that combines so many different styles and tries to take on a national narrative, blah blah, would put him in a different league even here. So, will we see different comics in graphic novels in Singapore after Sunny? I think so. I would not hazard. I would not dare to try to guess whether any of them would succeed in the same way. Singapore has some very contextual issues with publishing, and but definitely he has caused everybody to sort of wake up and get a little more ambitious. And I think that can only be good for everyone.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all the panelists, and thank you for putting this together.